It turns out, as you were speaking, I was looking at the stats around fatherless homes, and it turns out that there has been a significant increase in the amount of young boys being raised without a father present. About 25% live without a biological step or adoptive father, according to the National Fatherhood Initiative. In the US has the world's highest rate of children living in a single parent household, and 92% of the time that's with the mother alone. And in 1968, only 11% of children lived with only their mother, compared to 21% in 2020. So that's doubled in the last 50 odd years, which is pretty staggering. And then obviously the consequence of that, as Scott described, is that individuals from father absent homes were 300% more likely to carry drugs, to carry guns, to deal drugs. And there's this huge plethora of mental health consequences if you don't have a father in the home. I mean, what do we do about that? And like, where are the fathers?
Yeah.
Where are the role? Where are they going?
Well, it's complicated. There's male abandonment. There's just no getting around it. But also going back to family courts, sometimes the courts in the our economy make it difficult for a man to stay involved in the kids' lives. And also, family courts getting better at saying, all right, the kids, I mean, just a personal anecdote. I have a friend who recently has gone through divorce, 2 daughters, very much wants to be involved in their lives. They're 13 and 15-year-old girls, and quite frankly, dad's there on the weekends, and they got their own thing going on. And they don't necessarily make dad a priority. And dad's not around for what I call the garbage time. And that is what I found with my boys is the moments of serendipity and connection happen randomly when you're taking them to school, when you're out in the back, jumping around or playing whatever it is, these garbage moments. And when you're not in the household, for whatever reason, there isn't that much garbage time. And I think slowly but surely they lose sometimes connection with their kid. There's something weird going on. I'm curious, Logan, if you've got data on this, but you have a 1-year-old daughter, right? You're going to be amazed when my 14-year-old boy had a Halloween party. And the boys are like cute, but they're dopes. They're boys. There's some 14-year-old girls who look like they could be the junior senator from Pennsylvania. They're 5'10". They're articulate. Yeah. Hello, Mr. Galloway. How are you? What a lovely home. And the boys are like, I don't know. And biologically, girls mature faster. Mm-hmm. Their prefrontal cortex is 18 months ahead of a boy's. An 18-year-old girl or woman is competing against a 16-and-a-half-year-old when she's competing against an 18-year-old. And they're even finding that it's getting worse, that women or girls are starting to menstruate earlier and boys' testicles are descending later. So the gap in maturity, biological gap, they think might even be growing, and they don't know if it's pesticides. But when I meet my 8th graders' colleagues, there's a huge difference between between the boys and the girls.
Yeah.
And one of Richard's suggestions is that we redshirt boys, that we hold them a year back. The boys start kindergarten at 6, whereas girls start at 5.
So the research in the UK shows that 70% of girls are ready to start school at age 5, but many fewer boys are capable of starting at that age in terms of readiness. And so if you were to hold boys back, then they might be on more equal playing field for those critical moments of 4 to 5, of 13 to 14, where the brains really develop at a different stage.
I want to talk about that sort of early education experience and how it can be adapted, but also just like if the environment of the classroom is right for boys. As we were talking about the point about fatherlessness as well, I found this graph, which is also pretty shocking. And it goes into something you said, Scott. It basically shows that the absence of a father on a boy causes depressive symptoms, but the absence of a father on a young girl doesn't cause the same depressive symptoms, which means that the absence of a father for a boy drastically increases their chance of being depressed, whereas if for a girl it doesn't.
There's a lot of other graphs that look like that in terms of women and young girls are just actually a lot more resilient in childhood. So if you are in foster care as a young woman, you have less negative outcomes than young men. And so there's this theory in parenting of, is your child an orchid or a dandelion? And so the orchid really needs very particular situations to grow. They need a certain amount of light. They need to be watered in a particular way, and they'll thrive in some situations and they will not thrive in others. Whereas a dandelion can really survive in many situations. And so women young girls tend to be more dandelions in childhood. And so that's why when you have a boy and a girl both in negative situations, the boy is more negatively impacted.
Boys are just weaker. There's a crazy stat I read that two 15-year-olds, a boy and a girl, both sexually molested. And to be clear, they're equally heinous crimes. But the boy who's sexually molested is 6 to 10 times more likely to kill himself later in life. It ends up that boys are just less resilient.
Do you think there's somehow more of a stigma there? Like, I wonder why that's
Shame,
so
they
dramatic.
can't talk about
Yeah.
it, aren't comfortable,
Yeah.
feel there's a lack. I mean, I think just until a few years ago, the social incentives were to never speak about it.
Right.
I was on Lewis Howe's podcast, and he just openly said, I was sexually abused as a child. And it was so shocking for me
Wow.
to hear this big, handsome guy.
Yeah.
I don't think he would have said it 10 or 20 years
I
ago.
agree.
I think people would have assumed that it was his fault. It made him less of a man. So I think a lot of that has hopefully gotten better. But we just have to acknowledge boys mentally and emotionally are weaker than girls.
Lewis Howes didn't admit that until a couple of years ago.
Is that right?
So he's lived with that his whole life. And
Wow.
it wasn't until he was, I think, having dysfunction in his relationships and a few other things had happened that he decided he wanted to say it publicly for the first time, which again feeds into your point. We actually asked some of our audience to write in, and one of the people that wrote in was a teacher in a primary/preschool. And she said to me, she was an anonymous teacher in Germany, and she says, every year it seems like more and more children, always boys, have this new energy to destroy the classroom dynamics. These boys almost always have two things in common: a lack of boundaries at home and unsupervised, unlimited access to all kinds of content on the internet, e.g. porn. Their perception of what is okay and what is right becomes completely distorted. I have tried so many things, and every year it's becoming an even bigger challenge. Young boys in school. So one proposal is to delay education for boys, put them in education later. Is the classroom itself a problem? Like the sitting in school, listening to someone speak at you. Someone proposed to me on this podcast before that boys need more sort of practical play, and the classroom isn't designed for that. I wasn't sure if that was...
Well, in single-sex boys' school, they end up with double the amount of recess time. And that is I equate boys to dogs. A happy dog is a tired dog. And if it's not tired, if it doesn't get to run, it's going to cause trouble. And I feel the same way about boys. So in these schools where they decide what's best for the boys, there's usually more exercise and more free play and more roughhousing, co-ed schools. And you're also seeing, I think with boys, I mean, there's just, by even acknowledging that men play a critical role in boys' lives a few years ago, that was seen as sexist. What, you mean, what, you're saying moms can't do this? And I can just tell you there are certain moments when my partner needs me to weigh in. I don't know if it's the depth of my voice, my physical size, the way they relate to me, the fact that I'm not, you need dad. Or that's what I have found, especially with boys. They need almost like that not physical intimidation, but it's almost like they begin tuning out their mom over time. I mean, they're incredibly close to their mother. They look to her for nurturing. When they really have a problem, I find they go to mom. But they will constantly test the boundaries, constantly. And I think a lot of single mothers, quite frankly, with boys, just can't keep a lid on that kid. They can't control the kid. So, and I think you're finding at schools when there's no male kind of, I don't know, involvement or that I don't know, what I'll call physical presence. And then you add on this dopa machine that they get used to squeezing a dopa bag 100 times a day as they need it. And then you take the dopa bag away, they're just more prone to emotional outbursts. I'm curious if you've done any research around why that emotional outburst more common among boys than girls?
I haven't done that research, but I am imagining that there's moms out there that are raising boys on their own, and they might be like, yes, it is hard, but what do I do?
Right.
And so for that boy who isn't taught by a lot of guys in school and isn't in the Boy Scouts, which doesn't exist anymore, or it doesn't have big brothers, big sisters, like what does that mom do?
So with that, you brought up Boy Scouts. In America, there's Scouts for America,
Right.
and it can be boys and girls.
Right.
But Girl Scouts have their own single
Yeah.
sex, but Boy Scouts aren't allowed to have their own
Right.
single sex. So the question is, all right, what do you do? And I think that we need a societal zeitgeist that says immediately, if there's no longer a male involved, we have to get other men involved and acknowledge that that's not being sexist, that's important that you get men involved. And I think so I came from a single parent household, raised by a single immigrant mother who lived and died as secretary, light of my life. As soon as my dad was gone and then he had to move away for work, she got other men involved in my life. And I had wonderful men involved in my life. I had a stockbroker. Neighbor down the hall came in with his girlfriend and said, "Do you want to go horseback riding?" He's taking me horseback riding. I don't know if men would be comfortable doing that in today's age. So getting men involved in their lives, after school programs, Boy Scouts. I had a lot of wonderful men. I used to go camping, and there were men everywhere involved in my life. And I worried that a lot of those institutions,
Yeah.
and also there's a reticence and a hesitance for men to get involved in a boy's life that isn't theirs, for fear they're going to be perceived as something's wrong with them.
I was thinking that. So if we have less men in the home raising the children, and then we go to school, and the stat says that 72% of teachers in middle school are women as well. There's no men at school either. It's no wonder that boys are struggling so severely at such a young, early age for so many reasons, because one would assume that they're being socialized in the same way as girls. I've got a mother at home, don't have a father. I've got women at school, don't have male teachers. I mean, that's a controversial thing to say. I'm sure it used to be, but I think people are waking up a little bit now.
We need more male teachers. There's more female fighter pilots per capita than male kindergarten teachers. There's an absence. There are some boys, not some, there are millions of boys in America whose first male role model is a prison guard.
Yeah.
And there are just no men in their lives. After school programs being canceled, no women, very, very few men, K through 12. Dad's not around. There are literally communities, you read articles about it, where it's like, where are the men?
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to figure out. Where are they?
Online.
Doesn't look like they're in work. They're not in college.
The reality is there just aren't, for a lot of reasons, a host of reasons, a lack of male involvement in kids' lives is a big, big factor leading to this. There are other factors. There's socioeconomic factors. There's biological factors. There's a lack of vocational training. There's outsourcing of many of the jobs that made a man's path to the middle class viable. I mean, you want to talk about the UK, a big problem is the lack of growth.
Yeah.
There's not a lot of income opportunities for a young man who's not exceptional. And what we've seen in the US is essentially, if you look at our economic policies and college, it's never been better to be remarkable. Like if you're in the top 10% of your high school class, you're going to make more money than the top 10% did 10, 20, 30. If you end up at Google, you're going to make a kid at Google who's amazing, computer science degree, can make millions of dollars by the time they're 30. But I can prove to every one of us mathematically that 99% of our children are not in the top 1%. And our economic policies have basically said that school and college is meant to identify a super class of 1%ers that we're going to try and turn into billionaires, instead of figuring out the infrastructure and the programs to ensure the bottom 90 have a shot at being in the top 10. And one of the stats is just around college acceptance. When I applied to UCLA, the acceptance rate was 76%. Now it's 9%. I was unremarkable for whatever reason, prefrontal cortex, single mother, whatever you want to call it. But back then they had the mission and the charge to let in unremarkable kids. And that's no longer the case because America's superpowers are optimism. And we all believe our kids in that top 1%. And the reality is they're not. Or people think, I like an economy where you can make $1 billion because that's going to be me one day.
Mm-hmm.
So they have ignored the fact that we are crowding more and more prosperity and opportunity into the remarkable. And for me, it comes down to what do we want in America and the UK? Do we want a super class of billionaires, or do we want a society and an operating system that gives unremarkable people a shot of being in the top 10%? It's become winner take all. And we have purposely created a set of economic and educational policies that crowd a massive amount of prosperity into the top 1%. And we have opted for it because we believe we have a shot at being in that top 1%.
I love that because I think the winner takes all applies to a lot of different things. So I bet the top 10% of Americans now are healthier than they've ever been, while the rest of the country
100%.
has never been healthy.
Best healthcare in the world if you're in the top 10%.
Yeah. Or in marriages, the top marriages today are the best marriages of all time, yet we have declining marriage rates. So we're nearing the lowest rate of marriage that we've ever had in American history. So most people or fewer people are getting married, but if you're, 2 college graduates who get married in your 30s, you might have an even stronger bond than people in the past. But that is a small group at the top.
Marriage has become a luxury item.
Yeah.
If you're in the top quintile of income earning households, you're 75% get married. If you're in the bottom quintile, only 25. If you're in the lower quintile of income earning men, only 1 in 4 chance of getting married.
And this has huge impact on our society because we know that married people are healthier, they're wealthier, they live longer. When couples are married, they actually have lower rates of child poverty. And so this has huge implications for our society if we're having fewer marriages, especially when you think about having fewer babies.
I want to get into dating and marriage and love and all those things. One of the things that really shocked me as I was preparing for this conversation was this graph, because this isn't the narrative that we hear. Can you both see this one?
Mm-hmm.
This is the reverse gender gap.
Oh, yeah.
Gender pay gap graph.
Right.
And it shows that young women are now out earning young men. That's not what I heard. In terms of if I log onto social media, we've been trying to fight the gender pay gap, but to see that young men are now falling behind, both in education, both in unemployment. Young men face higher unemployment, nearly twice the rate of women. Looking at the early developmental stats, this graph was horrifying. I actually couldn't believe that was true, that young boys are struggling so much in education, but then to see also that it's reflected in...
So that graph shows that boys age 16 to 24 are making 10% less in full-time employment than women. And so it is true that we're seeing a reverse income graph. But what we do need to talk about is even when women make more in their 20s, that changes around age 30.
And they have kids.
When they have kids,
Yeah.
right? It's like this meteorite hits
Yeah.
and there's this huge burden placed on women. And I think that's a big part of the conversation that we'll talk about when we talk about dating is women still feel like they have to have, do all the household chores and raise the kids, but suddenly they have to earn a full-time income too.
100%.
And so many of the gender roles are changing. And so, yes, that graph is true. We have seen since 2020 that there's a shift, but I don't want to just say, oh, women are making more in perpetuity, because as soon as there's kids involved, they pay the price.
Do you said that women feel the need to then also earn a career and all those things? Where did that come from?
Well, there's this idea of hypergamy. So traditionally, women seek partners who have more economic or social status than they do. And for most of human history, this worked because men had the resources. And so there was sort of this arrangement where women could often marry someone who is more educated or earned more. But over the last 50 years, that's really changed. And so what I'm seeing in my work, working one-on-one with women, is that when they say that there aren't enough good guys to go around, that's actually true. So we now have this huge mating gap where we have these high-performing, high-earning women that have done the work and gone to therapy and work out, and they're ready for their great partner, but they're not able to find enough guys who are available. And if this is a problem now with the women I work with in their 30s, we are going to be facing a much more severe crisis 10, 15 years from now. So currently 60% of college enrollment is women, but soon it's going to be for every 2 women that graduate, it'll be 1 man. So that means half of those women will not have a guy who graduated from college. And so this is a crisis because these women are saying, okay, if you cannot be the provider, then you need to be offering more. Emotional intelligence is the new currency in dating. But these guys were raised not to be emotionally intelligent, not to give emotional support, but to be a provider. And so they've been chasing this lion. I'm going to hunt for this lion of being a provider. But suddenly they're told you need to hunt for a tiger, which is emotional intelligence. They don't have the skills to do that. And so women have raised the bar in terms of what they need from men, while men are continuously falling behind.
100%. Yeah, there's a lot there. There's some nuance around the pay thing. So the data I've seen is that women under the age of 30 in urban areas are now making more money. But to your point, the moment they have kids, where corporate America has really failed is it hasn't figured out a way to maintain a woman's professional trajectory once she decides to deploy her ovaries and have kids. And there's some data saying, okay, 2/3 of divorce can be reverse engineered to the man starting to make less money. When the woman in the relationship starts making more money, they become twice as likely to get divorced, 3 times as likely to use ED drugs because the guy loses a sense of purpose and self-esteem. What gets lost in that data is the reality is if a woman is stepping up and stepping into the economic void and being more economically, being a greater economic contributor, then logically it would make sense that men need to step up logistically. And I think what a lot of women are saying is like, okay, I'm not getting anything. You're no longer a provider. And by the way, you haven't filled that void. You haven't made up the delta. Mm-hmm. So there's some nuance around it. What also I think is important to say is that if women are better students and showing the discipline and the skills to go to college in an information economy and making more money, then okay, good on them. Just as for whatever reason, men made more money. Maybe it wasn't fair, but it's not a crime against humanity if women have the skills to make more money. What happens, though, is the second order effects that you're talking about, and that is, and we don't like to talk about this, 75% of women say that economic viability is hugely important in a mate. Only 25% of men. For men, it's not a criteria. For women, it is. And Chris Williamson of the Modern Wisdom podcast, he has this great stat, or he calls it the high heels effect. And that is 50% of women say they won't date a man shorter than them. I'm curious what you think, but I think it's more like 80%. I think it's an embarrassing thing to say because just instinctively, women feel like they'll be vulnerable during gestation and they want someone they think physically could protect them. I just think it's hardwired into them even if they don't know it. Women, metaphorically, are getting taller every year. And women made horizontally and up and men horizontally and down.
Right.
And when the pool of horizontal and up keeps shrinking, they just have, so this notion, a ton of great women, where are the men? Or there's no men. There's a lot of men, just not men they'd want to date.
Right.
And then you speedball it with the guys who are in the top 10% can engage in Porsche polygamy. They can get a date every goddamn night, which does not encourage long-term or very good behavior. So the guys they all want are not incented to enter into long-term relationships. And the bottom half of men are literally shut out of the mating market. And we always kind of, and this goes to your bailiwick, kind of portray men as the predators and the idiots and they just got their act together. There's something strange going on in that as online dating, when a woman can go out with a guy, a high status male, and I'll put forward this thesis and I want you to respond to it. She can have sex with him, which gives her the impression that's her weight class for a relationship, but he's not interested in a relationship. And then she basically decides the bottom 90 are no longer in her weight class. And you can't tell a woman to lower her expectations, but the reality is, and what the data I've seen on dating apps is that all of the women want the same few guys and they shut out the rest.
Can I ask a favor? Please, can you hit the subscribe button? If you've watched more than one before, how about that? If you've watched more than one, first one free, buy one, get one free. The second one, I'm going to have to ask you to subscribe. If this is the first time you've seen a clip on this channel, move along. You don't need to subscribe. But if you've seen one before, please do me a favor, help a guy out, hit the subscribe button. Thank you so much.